For 600 years, every scholar who touched this book failed, but the woman no one remembered was about to uncover the truth that even the Vampire King had long since surrendered to silence. Savannah Reed never imagined that the oldest mystery in history would begin on an ordinary Tuesday morning inside the oldest public library in Boston. At 26 years old, she earned barely enough to cover rent on her tiny apartment above a family-owned bakery where the scent of fresh bread drifted through her windows every dawn. Her clothes were simple, her shoes had been repaired twice instead of replaced, and every paycheck disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. Yet none of that mattered once she stepped between the towering shelves of Ashcroft Historical Library. Books had always been kinder to Savannah than people. Dust-covered manuscripts never judged her worn sweater, ancient maps never laughed at her quiet voice. Forgotten journals never cared that she skipped lunch to save money. Every morning she unlocked the heavy oak doors exactly at 8 o'clock, switched on the brass reading lamps one by one, and welcomed another peaceful day surrounded by stories left behind by people who had vanished centuries before. Most visitors came searching for local genealogy or old newspapers, but Savannah found herself drawn to forgotten corners no one else visited, hidden shelves tucked behind carved columns, locked cabinets whose keys were older than the United States itself, cracked leather volumes whose pages had yellowed long before electricity existed. She believed every abandoned book carried a voice waiting patiently for someone willing to listen. That quiet curiosity was the only luxury she could afford. On that particular morning, rain tapped gently against the stained glass windows while grey clouds wrapped the city in a soft mist. The library felt unusually still, as though even time had decided to slow its pace. Savannah balanced a stack of donated books against her hip and carried them into the Restoration Archive beneath the main reading hall. The basement smelled of cedar wood, old paper, and polished stone. Few employees enjoyed working there because the air always seemed colder than the rest of the building, but Savannah loved its silence. As she sorted through the donations, one object immediately caught her attention. It wasn't the largest volume in the collection, nor the oldest looking. In fact, it appeared surprisingly plain. Bound in faded black leather without a title, its cover displayed only a small silver emblem, shaped like a crescent moon surrounding an unfamiliar star. There was no author, no publication date, no catalog number. Even stranger, no record accompanied the donation. Every book entering the archive required paperwork, yet this one had arrived without a trace. Savannah frowned. That alone was enough to violate every library procedure she knew. She carefully opened the brittle cover, expecting handwritten notes or perhaps missing ownership stamps. Instead, she found page after page filled with symbols unlike anything she had ever seen. They were elegant, almost musical, flowing across the parchment in graceful curves and geometric patterns that refused to resemble Latin, Greek, Hebrew, or any language she recognized. She gently adjusted the desk lamp, studying the ink more closely. It shimmered faintly beneath the warm light, not with magic but with the subtle glow of ancient metallic pigments rarely preserved after hundreds of years. Most people would have closed the book and labeled it undeciphered. Savannah reached for a magnifying lens instead. Her fingers traced the margins without touching the delicate parchment. Something felt strangely familiar, not the symbols themselves but the rhythm between them. Every seventh character repeated at carefully measured intervals. Tiny dots formed invisible alignments across opposite pages. Even the empty spaces seemed intentionally placed rather than accidental. It didn't read like a language, it behaved like a puzzle. Her heartbeat quickened. She quietly fetched 3 reference atlases, an encyclopedia of medieval astronomical charts, and a forgotten notebook filled with sketches she had copied from historical manuscripts over the years. One by one she compared patterns, circles, star positions, decorative flourishes, and numerical spacing. Minutes slipped into hours, falling beyond the stained glass windows. The deeper she looked, the clearer one impossible realization became. The symbols weren't meant to be read from left to right. They followed the movement of constellations. Every page mirrored the night sky from a different century. Savannah leaned back in stunned silence. "This isn't a language," she whispered to herself. "It's a map disguised as one." At that exact moment, somewhere hundreds of miles away beneath towering stone walls hidden deep within ancient mountains, a massive bronze bell that had remained silent for 6 centuries released a single deep resonance that echoed through halls no human had entered in generations. Candles flickered across an enormous royal library carved entirely from black marble. Dozens of vampire scholars froze where they stood. Their conversations stopped instantly. Every ancient eye turned toward the vaulted ceiling as the sound lingered through the air like the awakening of history itself. Upon a throne carved from obsidian, King Enzo Vitale slowly lifted his head from an unopened manuscript. His pale face remained unreadable, but his silver-grey eyes with unmistakable focus. The bell had never rung by accident, not once in 600 years. It answered only one thing. Someone, somewhere, had just taken the first correct step toward uncovering the secret he had spent centuries believing would remain buried forever. Savannah stared at the open manuscript long after the rain outside had faded into a gentle drizzle. Every instinct told her she should close the mysterious volume, report it to her supervisor, and continue cataloguing the remaining donations. That was what library protocol required. Yet something stronger than curiosity kept her seated beneath the warm brass lamp. The patterns refused to leave her thoughts. They were too deliberate to be decorative and too precise to be random. She pulled another reference atlas closer and carefully compared the positions of the tiny silver dots with celestial charts recorded by astronomers throughout history. Most matched familiar constellations, but several did not exist in any modern record. That impossible discovery should have discouraged her. Instead, it convinced her she was looking at a sky that belonged to another era. Savannah reached for a fresh notebook and began sketching every symbol exactly as it appeared. Measuring the distance between each mark with a small drafting ruler she kept in her desk. Hours disappeared unnoticed. She forgot about lunch. She ignored the vibration of her phone reminding her about an overdue electric bill. Even the distant footsteps of visitors faded into the background as her mind assembled pieces that had remained scattered for centuries. By early afternoon, her supervisor, Margaret Holloway, descended into the archive carrying a stack of returned books. She smiled when she found Savannah completely surrounded by open reference volumes. "You have that look again," Margaret said with a quiet laugh. "The one that tells me you have forgotten the rest of the world." Savannah smiled apologetically. "I think someone donated something extraordinary." Margaret glanced toward the plain black manuscript resting on the table. "There is no catalogue record for that one. I checked twice this morning. It almost feels as though it appeared by itself." Savannah looked up. "Did anyone sign the donation ledger?" Margaret slowly shook her head. "Not a single name. Security footage only shows an empty donation cart when the staff unlocked the building." The answer should have sounded impossible, yet neither woman laughed. Ashcroft Historical Library had collected strange stories over its 180-year history. Forgotten maps had appeared inside unrelated books. Anonymous collectors occasionally mailed priceless manuscripts without explanation. Still, this felt different. Margaret studied Savannah's growing collection of sketches. "Do you recognize the writing?" "Not exactly," Savannah admitted, "because I do not think it is writing at all." She explained her theory that the symbols followed celestial movements rather than grammar. Margaret listened patiently before placing the returned books onto a nearby cart. "If anyone can figure it out, it will be you," she said warmly. "Just promise me you will go home before midnight this time." Savannah laughed softly. "I promise." Margaret climbed the stairs, leaving the archive silent once again. Savannah returned to the manuscript, but now her attention shifted toward the edges of each page rather than the symbols themselves. Tiny scratches marked the corners, almost too faint to notice. They resembled accidental damage until she aligned photographs of multiple pages side by side. Her pulse quickened. The scratches formed another pattern. She quickly retrieved transparent archival sheets and layered them over her sketches. One after another, the faint corner marks connected into straight lines until they revealed the outline of an enormous circular design unlike anything she had ever seen. It looked less like a map and more like a mechanical instrument built to track the movement of stars across generations. At its exact center rested a symbol identical to the silver emblem embossed on the book's cover. Savannah leaned closer. "Everything points back to this," she whispered. She carefully turned another page, expecting more symbols. Instead, she froze. The parchment appeared completely blank. At least it did until a shaft of late afternoon sunlight slipped through the narrow basement window and struck the page at an angle. Delicate silver lines slowly emerged from the empty surface like frost appearing across cold glass. Savannah immediately adjusted the desk lamp, but the lines disappeared again. She moved the manuscript closer to the window. The hidden markings returned. They were not written with ordinary ink. They responded only to natural light. She hurried upstairs. borrowed a portable skylight prism from the preservation laboratory and carried it back downstairs. By redirecting sunlight across the page from different angles, more hidden lines emerged until an elegant illustration slowly revealed itself. It showed the same crescent moon surrounding a single star, but beneath the image appeared one sentence written in flawless English, as though someone had expected a future reader to discover it. It simply read, "Only the patient will hear what history refused to say." Savannah felt a chill run through her arms. Every other page remained filled with unknown symbols, yet this single sentence spoke directly to her. Before she could study it further, the lights overhead flickered once. Then again, a soft vibration traveled through the old stone floor beneath her chair. Dust drifted from wooden beams overhead. It lasted only a few seconds before everything became still again. Somewhere inside the library, an antique grandfather clock began striking 4 o'clock despite having been permanently broken for nearly 20 years. Upstairs, several visitors paused in confusion as the forgotten bell echoed through the reading room. Savannah slowly looked toward the silent manuscript resting before her. She had come to work expecting another ordinary day of shelving books and repairing worn bindings. Instead, every answer she uncovered seemed to awaken another mystery waiting beneath it. And although she could not possibly know it, far beyond Boston, inside the ancient mountain kingdom hidden from the modern world, King Enzo Vitale had already ordered every royal scholar to gather before sunset because someone had finally begun reading the one secret history that destiny had protected for 600 years. By the time twilight settled over Boston, the last visitors had drifted out of Ashcroft Historical Library, leaving only the quiet hum of old ventilation systems and the comforting scent of aging paper. Savannah Reed glanced at the antique wall clock and realized she had worked nearly 3 hours past the end of her shift without noticing. She carefully closed the mysterious manuscript and locked it inside a climate-controlled preservation case before gathering her notebook. Every page was now filled with observations, sketches, star alignments, and questions that seemed to multiply faster than she could answer them. As she climbed the marble staircase toward the main entrance, she noticed something unusual. The security guards, who normally chatted with one another while closing the building, stood silently facing the tall stained glass windows as though listening for something outside. One of them finally smiled awkwardly when he noticed Savannah. "Strange day," he said. "The old building has been making sounds we have never heard before." Savannah simply nodded. She could not explain why she felt responsible. After stepping into the cool evening air, she walked the familiar 6 blocks toward her apartment, but even the city seemed subtly different. The streetlights reflected across rain-soaked sidewalks like scattered stars. People hurried past carrying umbrellas, unaware that somewhere beyond their ordinary lives an ancient secret had begun to awaken. Savannah stopped briefly outside the neighborhood bakery beneath her apartment to buy a discounted loaf of bread before climbing the narrow staircase to the small studio she had called home for nearly 4 years. The apartment was modest but comforting. One bookshelf stretched across an entire wall, overflowing with history books rescued from library clearance sales. A tiny telescope rested beside the single window overlooking the quiet street. Every clear night, Savannah spent a few minutes studying constellations before bed, a habit she had inherited from her late grandfather, who always insisted that history was written both on paper and across the sky. She smiled gently at the memory while opening her notebook once again. Something continued bothering her. She spread the sketches across the kitchen table beside an old star chart and stared at them in silence. The hidden message she had uncovered was not a conclusion, it was an invitation. Only the patient will hear what history refused to say. Whoever created the manuscript expected someone to continue searching. They wanted the mystery solved, but only by someone willing to earn every answer. Across the continent, beyond mountains hidden from every modern map, another library remained illuminated despite the deepening night. Unlike Ashcroft Historical Library, this archive was carved entirely from black stone, polished smooth by centuries of careful hands. Thousands of leather-bound volumes rested upon towering shelves that disappeared into darkness high above. Candles burned with steady silver flames, casting soft reflections across marble floors where generations of royal scholars had walked before. At the center of the immense chamber stood King Enzo Vitale. His presence filled the room without a single unnecessary movement. His pale face reflected the candlelight like carved ivory, while his tailored black coat blended almost seamlessly with the surrounding shadows. Around him gathered the oldest scholars of the vampire kingdom, each carrying manuscripts that had been studied for decades without success. No one dared speak until Enzo finally broke the silence. "The sentinel bell has awakened," he said calmly. His voice was quiet, yet every word carried effortlessly across the vast chamber. "Tell me why." An elderly historian stepped forward and lowered his head respectfully. "Your Majesty, the bell has remained silent since the reign of your grandfather. According to every surviving record, it responds only when the codex of the First Archive begins revealing its hidden path." Another scholar added carefully, "We believed the codex had been lost forever." Enzo slowly turned toward the towering stained glass dome above the library. "Beyond it stretched an endless night sky filled with familiar," he answered. His expression remained composed, but deep within his silver-grey eyes rested something few had witnessed in centuries: hope. 600 years earlier, he had personally ordered the search for that manuscript after inheriting the throne. Every historian, astronomer, linguist, mathematician, and royal archivist had failed to unlock its meaning. Entire generations dedicated their lives to solving its symbols before eventually accepting defeat. Over time, the search became legend, then myth, and finally little more than a forgotten story whispered among scholars. Yet the bell had spoken. That meant someone had succeeded where every expert had failed. A younger advisor stepped cautiously into the circle. "Should we prepare the royal investigation?" Enzo remained silent for several moments before answering. "No armies, no public announcement. Find the manuscript quietly." "And the person reading it?" Enzo looked toward one enormous stone doorway sealed by intricate silver carvings. Behind it rested the chamber no one except the reigning king had entered for centuries. "Observe," he replied. "Do not interfere." Hundreds in Savannah finally noticed one final detail inside her notebook. Earlier that afternoon, she had copied the mysterious silver emblem dozens of times without realizing that each version contained an almost invisible difference. The crescent moon remained identical, but the tiny star at its center shifted position every time she redrew it from another page. Her heart began beating faster. She arranged the drawings in chronological order and slowly connected the changing star positions with a pencil. A graceful spiral emerged across the paper. It was not random. It pointed toward a precise location on her grandfather's antique celestial map hanging beside the window. Savannah stood, walked to the framed chart, and carefully compared the spiral with the faded constellation printed there decades earlier. The patterns aligned perfectly. There, tucked into the margin of the map near an unfamiliar cluster of stars, her grandfather had written a single handwritten note years before in neat blue ink. "Some libraries are not built on Earth." The next morning, Savannah arrived at Ashcroft Historical Library nearly an hour earlier than usual. Dawn had barely begun to color the Boston skyline when she unlocked the side entrance and stepped into the silent building, carrying nothing more than a travel mug of coffee, her grandfather's worn celestial map, and the notebook that had stolen her sleep. Every answer she uncovered seemed to lead toward an even older question, and for the first time in years she felt less like a librarian and more like an explorer standing at the edge of forgotten history. She walked directly to the preservation archive and unlocked the climate-controlled case. The mysterious manuscript rested exactly where she had left it, its plain black cover giving no hint of the centuries of secrets hidden inside. As she carefully opened the first page, early morning sunlight filtered through the narrow basement window. The silver symbols shimmered once again, but this time Savannah noticed something she had completely overlooked. The brightness of the markings shifted every few minutes as the angle of the sunlight changed. It was almost as though the manuscript expected the sun to move before revealing the next clue. She quickly positioned the antique prism she had borrowed the previous afternoon and adjusted its angle until a narrow beam of natural light stretched across the parchment. New silver lines slowly appeared where the page had looked empty only moments earlier. They did not form words, they formed circles. Smaller circles surrounded larger ones, while tiny symbols connected them with graceful curves. Savannah immediately reached for her grandfather's celestial map. One by one, she compared every circle with familiar constellations until she suddenly realized she had been looking at them the wrong way. They were not stars, they were libraries. Each circle represented a place where knowledge had been protected across different civilizations: Alexandria, Constantinople, Oxford, Kyoto, Boston. Every location was connected by a single elegant path that eventually disappeared into one final circle drawn with thicker silver ink than all the others. No name appeared beside it, only the crescent moon embracing a solitary star. Savannah leaned closer, barely breathing. "This is not showing where books are," she whispered. "It is showing where history traveled." Excitement quickly gave way to confusion. Why would an unknown manuscript hide a map connecting libraries across centuries? What could possibly exist at the final destination that justified such extraordinary secrecy? Before she could continue, footsteps echoed softly across the archive floor. Margaret Holloway entered carrying a small cardboard package wrapped in brown paper. "Good morning," she said with a smile. "This arrived before opening. It is addressed to you." Savannah looked surprised. Almost no one mailed her anything. The package displayed no return address. Only her name had been written in elegant black ink. She carefully untied the string and opened the box. Inside rested an old brass compass unlike any she had seen before. Instead of the traditional north, south, east, and west markings, the outer ring displayed tiny celestial symbols nearly identical to those inside the mysterious manuscript. Folded beneath the compass lay a single cream-colored card. Savannah unfolded it slowly. The message contained only one sentence. "Trust the sky before you trust the page." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "Do you know who sent it?" Savannah quietly shook her head. "No." The two women exchanged puzzled glances. There was no postage stamp, no shipping label, no delivery receipt. It was as though someone had simply placed the package outside the library before sunrise. Margaret finally spoke. "Perhaps someone knows you are researching the manuscript." Savannah looked back toward the ancient book resting beneath the morning light. "That is exactly what worries me." Far away, hidden beyond forests and mountains untouched by modern civilization, preparations had quietly begun inside the royal citadel. King Enzo Vitale stood alone upon a stone balcony overlooking an endless valley covered in mist. The morning sun had not yet reached the towering castle walls, leaving the ancient fortress wrapped in cool silver shadows. Behind him, Captain Matteo De Luca approached with stopping several feet away. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, "our observers have confirmed the manuscript has resurfaced." Enzo did not turn around, and the reader, a human woman in Boston. Savannah Reed, 26 years old, librarian, no criminal record, no political connections, no known interest in the supernatural. Enzo remained silent as the mountain breeze stirred the edges of his black coat. "Does she know what she possesses?" Matteo asked. "Not yet," Enzo replied calmly. "She believes she is solving a forgotten puzzle. Should we retrieve the codex before others discover it?" The king slowly shook his head. "If anyone else could have solved it, they would have done so centuries ago." Matteo lowered his gaze respectfully. "Then what are your orders?" Finally turned. His pale expression revealed neither fear nor excitement, only quiet certainty shaped by 600 years of patience. "Protect her without being seen." Matteo looked surprised. "Even if she never learns who we are." "Especially then," Enzo answered. "The Codex has chosen movement after centuries of silence. We will not interrupt the path it has already begun." Back inside the archive, Savannah placed the mysterious compass beside the manuscript. The moment the brass instrument touched the wooden table, its needle spun wildly before slowing to a complete stop. It did not point north. It pointed directly toward the open page displaying the hidden map of forgotten libraries. Then, almost unbelievably, the silver star at the center of the manuscript emitted the faintest glow, and another line appeared beneath the final unnamed circle. It contained only 3 carefully written words. "The first archive awaits." The words remained motionless upon the ancient page, yet Savannah could not shake the feeling that they had been written specifically for her. "The first archive awaits." She read the sentence again, searching for hidden meanings, but the elegant silver lettering revealed nothing more. The brass compass beside the manuscript continued pointing unwaveringly toward the glowing emblem at the center of the map. Unlike ordinary magnetic needles, it did not tremble or drift. It behaved with absolute certainty. Savannah carefully lifted the compass into her hands. The moment she did, the needle slowly rotated away from the manuscript and pointed toward the eastern wall of the archive. She frowned. There was nothing there except rows of preservation cabinets and a large mural illustrating the history of Ashcroft Historical Library. Curious, she walked across the room. With every step, the compass needle remained fixed ahead. When she finally stopped in front of the mural, the needle settled perfectly still. The painting had hung there for decades, depicting generations of librarians standing proudly before the library's grand entrance through different periods of American history. Savannah had passed it thousands of times without giving it more than a passing glance. Today, one small detail immediately caught her attention. In the background of the oldest section of the mural stood a stone fountain that no longer existed. Above it was carved the same crescent moon embracing a solitary star. Her heartbeat quickened. She leaned closer until she noticed faint scratches beneath layers of aged varnish. They were almost invisible unless viewed from the side. Without damaging the artwork, she carefully adjusted a portable restoration light to shine across the surface at a shallow angle. Hidden lines slowly appeared beneath the paint, revealing another geometric pattern identical to those inside the manuscript. It was not part of the original artwork. Someone had intentionally concealed it within the mural generations earlier. Savannah immediately photographed every detail with her phone before comparing the pattern with her notebook. The symbols aligned perfectly with one section of the celestial map. "This library has been connected to the manuscript all along," she whispered. Her thoughts raced through decades of forgotten renovation records she had organized months earlier. The fountain in the painting had once stood inside the original courtyard before an expansion covered that section of the building almost 100 years ago. If the mural accurately preserved its location, then something connected to the manuscript might still exist beneath the modern foundation. Before she could investigate further, Margaret Holloway entered carrying a folder of architectural blueprints requested from the city archives. She placed them on a nearby table with an amused smile. "I had a feeling you would ask for these eventually." Savannah looked up in surprise. "How did you know?" Margaret laughed softly. "Because every time you become interested in an old mystery, you eventually start asking about walls, basements, or forgotten rooms." Together they unfolded the fragile blueprints across a large restoration table. Layer by layer they traced the evolution of the building through nearly 2 centuries of renovations. Most additions made perfect sense until they reached the earliest foundation plans. Savannah suddenly pointed toward one small circular chamber marked beneath the original courtyard. "There," she said quietly. "What is that room?" Margaret adjusted her reading glasses. "That is strange. There is no description." The chamber appeared on the oldest blueprint, then disappeared entirely from every renovation plan that followed. It was as though someone had intentionally erased it from the library's history. The only surviving clue was a handwritten construction note beside the faded drawing. "Preserve the lower sanctuary. Access restricted by original charter." Margaret slowly looked up. "I have worked here for 27 years and I have never heard anyone mention a lower sanctuary." Savannah felt the same quiet excitement building inside her once again. Every answer uncovered another hidden layer. Every hidden layer suggested someone had carefully protected this secret for generations without destroying it. Thousands of miles away inside the mountain citadel, King Enzo Vitale walked alone through a vast corridor lined with marble statues honoring rulers who had governed before him. None of them carried expressions of triumph. Instead, each face reflected the weight of responsibility passed from one generation to the next. Enzo eventually reached an enormous bronze door engraved with countless celestial symbols. He rested one pale hand against the cool metal but made no attempt to open it. "Soon," he said almost silently. Footsteps approached from behind as Captain Matteo returned, carrying an ancient scroll sealed with dark blue wax. "Your Majesty, the Royal Observatory has completed its calculations." Enzo accepted the scroll and quietly broke the seal. The parchment contained only a single diagram. It showed 7 ancient libraries connected by one luminous path ending beneath a symbol identical to the manuscript's silver emblem. One new mark had appeared beside Boston. Matteo carefully watched the king's expression. "Does that mean the path has advanced?" Enzo nodded once. "For the first time in 6 centuries. Will she reach the first archive?" Matteo asked. Enzo slowly rolled the parchment closed. "Only if she continues asking the questions everyone else stopped asking." Back inside Ashcroft Historical Library, Savannah compared the mysterious compass with the century-old blueprints one final time. The needle shifted once more before settling directly over the faded drawing of the forgotten circular chamber beneath the original courtyard. At almost the same moment, every clock inside the library stopped simultaneously for exactly 7 seconds. When the hands began moving again, one narrow section of the eastern wall released the faintest mechanical click. Neither Savannah nor Margaret had touched it, yet somewhere beyond the shelves, A hidden door that had remained sealed for generations had quietly unlocked itself. Neither Savannah nor Margaret moved for several seconds after hearing the faint mechanical click echo behind the eastern wall. The sound had not come from the old heating system or settling stone. It was clean, deliberate, and unmistakably precise. Margaret slowly looked around the archive before whispering, "Please tell me you heard that too." Savannah nodded without taking her eyes off the blueprint spread across the restoration table. "I did." The brass compass remained perfectly still, its needle pointing directly toward the same section of wall where the hidden chamber had once been marked nearly 2 centuries earlier. Savannah picked up a flashlight from the preservation cabinet and carefully approached the towering bookshelves lining the eastern side of the archive. At first, nothing appeared unusual. Hundreds of carefully catalogued historical volumes rested exactly where they should. The polished oak shelves showed no visible seams or concealed handles, yet when she held the flashlight parallel to the wall instead of directly at it, a narrow vertical shadow became visible between 2 sections of stone. It was barely wider than a sheet of paper. Margaret stepped beside her and gently brushed her fingers across the carved molding surrounding the shelf. "This was never part of the original architecture," she murmured. "Someone disguised it during the expansion." Savannah's attention shifted toward one decorative brass ornament shaped like a crescent moon near the top of the shelving unit. Unlike every other ornament in the archive, this one had been polished by repeated contact over many decades. She reached upward and lightly pressed it. Nothing happened. She tried rotating it instead. A soft metallic sound answered from somewhere deep inside the wall. Slowly, almost silently, the enormous bookshelf shifted several inches to one side, revealing a narrow stone passage hidden behind it. Neither woman spoke. Cool air drifted from the darkness, carrying the faint scent of cedar, limestone, and parchment untouched for generations. Savannah lifted the flashlight and directed its beam down the passage. Ancient stone steps descended into darkness before disappearing beneath an arched ceiling supported by carved pillars. Every surface appeared remarkably well preserved despite its age. There were no cobwebs, no collapsed masonry. It looked less like a forgotten ruin and more like a place intentionally protected from time itself. Margaret finally broke the silence. "We should probably notify the Historical Preservation Office." Savannah smiled nervously. "We probably should." Neither of them moved. Curiosity quietly won the argument. They descended carefully, counting each worn stone step, 21 in total. At the bottom, the narrow corridor opened into a circular chamber, almost identical to the one illustrated on the original blueprint. The room was surprisingly beautiful. White marble floors reflected the flashlight with a soft glow, while dozens of carved stone shelves stood completely empty around the perimeter. At the exact center rested a single pedestal supporting an elegant bronze sphere covered in tiny engraved constellations. Savannah slowly approached it. The mysterious brass compass in her hand suddenly became warm. Without warning, its needle spun rapidly before stopping once again. This time it pointed directly toward the sphere. She hesitated only a moment before placing the compass gently upon the pedestal. A quiet chime echoed through the chamber. Thin rings surrounding the bronze sphere began rotating with remarkable precision, aligning stars, moons, and unfamiliar celestial symbols into a new configuration. Soft silver light emerged from narrow openings between the rings, illuminating the ceiling for the first time in centuries. Margaret looked upward in amazement. Thousands of tiny crystals embedded within the stone roof reflected the light until the entire chamber resembled a perfectly accurate night sky. Savannah realized she was no longer looking at decoration. She was standing beneath a 3-dimensional star map. Then something even more extraordinary happened. One constellation slowly brightened while every other star remained dim. Savannah compared it with her grandfather's celestial chart and immediately recognized the pattern. It matched the mysterious spiral she had discovered the previous evening. As the final star illuminated, elegant lettering appeared across the marble floor surrounding the pedestal. The words were written in flawless English despite the chamber clearly predating the language by centuries. "Knowledge belongs to those who protect truth above power." Savannah read the sentence aloud. The moment the final word left her lips, another section of the circular wall quietly opened. Inside rested a small stone table supporting a single crystal case. Within the transparent enclosure lay an aged leather journal tied with a faded blue ribbon. Beside it rested an old silver key engraved with the familiar crescent moon and solitary star. Savannah carefully opened the crystal case. There were no alarms, no locks, only a folded letter resting on top of the journal. She unfolded the delicate paper and found another handwritten message. If you have reached this room, then you solve the first question without seeking glory. Continue only if you value truth more than certainty. She looked toward Margaret, who stood speechless beneath the glowing ceiling. Far beyond Boston, inside the hidden mountain kingdom, royal astronomers watched enormous brass instruments rotate across the observatory dome as every celestial calculation shifted into perfect alignment. Captain Matteo entered the chamber carrying fresh reports before stopping beside King Enzo Vitale. "Your Majesty," he said quietly, unable to hide his astonishment, "the first archive has awakened." Enzo closed his eyes for a brief moment, as though hearing the echo of a promise carried across 6 centuries. When he finally opened them again, even the oldest scholars noticed something they had never witnessed before. The ancient king was smiling, not because the mystery had been solved, but because the one person worthy of solving it had just taken the next step exactly as history intended. The crystal case remained open as Savannah carefully lifted the weathered journal into her hands. Unlike the mysterious manuscript upstairs, this book immediately felt personal. Its leather cover had softened with age, its corners rounded by countless careful hands, and faint impressions along the spine suggested it had been opened thousands of times before finally being sealed away. The faded blue ribbon tied around it was surprisingly well preserved, almost untouched by time. Savannah loosened the ribbon with slow, deliberate movements before opening the first page. She expected another collection of unfamiliar symbols. Instead, she found elegant English handwriting flowing across the parchment in dark brown ink that had barely faded despite the passing centuries. At the very top of the page, a single sentence immediately captured her attention. "History is never lost. It is only hidden from those who seek power before wisdom." Savannah read the words aloud almost instinctively. The quiet chamber seemed to absorb every syllable before returning them as a soft echo beneath the glowing ceiling. Margaret stepped closer, studying the pages over Savannah's shoulder. "Someone wanted this to be understood," she whispered. Savannah nodded. "Not by everyone, by whoever reached this room." She turned the page carefully. The journal did not contain the diary of a king or the memoirs of a conqueror. It belonged to an archivist. Every entry described the responsibility of preserving truth instead of controlling it. Dates stretched across centuries, each generation passing the journal to another guardian whose only duty was protecting knowledge from those who might reshape history for their own ambitions. One passage stopped Savannah completely. "The first archive is not a building, it is a promise. Wherever truth survives untouched, the archive lives." She looked up thoughtfully. The hidden chamber surrounding them suddenly made much more sense. It had never been intended as the destination. It was only the first doorway. Turning another page, Savannah discovered an intricate illustration showing 7 ancient archives connected by elegant celestial paths. 6 of the locations had been crossed out with careful blue ink. Only one remained untouched. Beneath it appeared a handwritten note. "The final collection remains beyond the mountains where the first guardians still keep their oath." Savannah immediately recognized the same crescent moon surrounding the solitary star beside the final location. It was identical to the emblem engraved on the mysterious silver key resting inside the crystal case. Margaret folded her arms thoughtfully. Beyond the mountains could mean almost anywhere. Savannah studied the illustration more carefully before slowly shaking her head. No, whoever wrote this expected the reader to understand where to look. She reached into her bag and unfolded her grandfather's celestial map beside the journal. The spiral pattern she had discovered earlier matched the final archive's location perfectly when aligned with a rarely charted group of northern constellations. Suddenly, the scattered clues from the manuscript, the hidden mural, the compass, and the underground chamber fit together like pieces of a single enormous puzzle. They had never been separate mysteries. They were milestones leading toward one destination. Before either woman could speak again, the bronze at the center of the chamber quietly rotated one final time. A narrow beam of silver light emerged from its center and settled directly upon the old journal. New writing slowly appeared across a previously blank page. Neither ink nor pen created the words. They simply revealed themselves as though waiting for the exact moment they were needed. "The 7th Guardian still waits." Savannah felt a quiet chill travel through her arms. "Guardian?" she repeated softly. Margaret looked equally puzzled. "Do you think whoever wrote this is still alive?" Savannah smiled faintly. "After everything we have found, I am no longer certain what impossible really means." Hundreds of miles away, inside the mountain citadel, a council of ancient vampire scholars gathered around an enormous circular table covered with maps older than entire nations. Their expressions reflected growing concern rather than celebration. One elderly advisor finally broke the silence. If the human reaches the final archive, every sealed record will become accessible. Another quietly added, many families have built their influence upon carefully edited history. Captain Matteo looked toward King Enzo Vitale before asking the question no one else wished to voice. Your Majesty, if the complete truth becomes public, many among the council will oppose it. Enzo remained perfectly calm. His silver-grey eyes rested upon the ancient star map spread across the table. Truth does not become dangerous because it exists, he said quietly. It becomes dangerous because people fear it. One council member hesitated before speaking. Some will attempt to stop her. Enzo met the elder's gaze without raising his voice. Then they will discover that protecting history has always been my first duty, long before ruling a kingdom became my second. Silence settled across the chamber. No one questioned him again. Back beneath Ashcroft Historical Library, Savannah carefully returned the journal to the crystal case before picking up the engraved silver key. Unlike the compass, it felt unexpectedly warm, almost welcoming. As soon as her fingers wrapped around it, a faint metallic sound echoed somewhere beyond the circular chamber. Another concealed doorway slowly opened, revealing a narrow stone corridor that stretched into darkness before ending at an oak door reinforced with polished silver bands. Above the doorway, carved into the stone with remarkable precision, appeared one final inscription. Only those who seek the whole story may enter. Savannah stood before the ancient oak door without reaching for the silver key. Every discovery over the past 2 days had rewarded patience instead of haste, and she refused to abandon that lesson now. She carefully examined the reinforced silver bands stretching across the weathered wood. They were not decorative. Tiny engraved constellations wound around each strip of metal, forming an intricate pattern that looked almost identical to the rotating bronze sphere behind them. Margaret watched quietly from several feet away. "You are thinking again," she said with a gentle smile. Savannah nodded. "Every door so far has opened because we understood something first, not because we forced it." She stepped back and compared the engravings with the sketch she had copied from the hidden journal only minutes earlier. The 7 archives formed a circular sequence, yet one constellation appeared slightly different above the doorway. It was not missing, it had been reversed. Savannah carefully rotated the silver key in her fingers until the engraved crescent moon pointed in the opposite direction. The moment she aligned the emblem with the reversed constellation, the key became noticeably warmer. She slid it gently into the old lock without turning it. A quiet click echoed from deep inside the mechanism before the key rotated almost effortlessly on its own. The heavy door slowly opened inward, revealing a surprisingly modest chamber beyond. There were no treasures, no towering shelves filled with forgotten books. Instead, a single wooden desk stood beneath a circular skylight carved through layers of stone high above. Soft afternoon sunlight streamed downward, illuminating thousands of tiny dust particles drifting peacefully through the air. Upon the desk rested only 3 objects: an empty leather journal, a simple fountain pen, and a sealed envelope addressed to no one. Savannah approached cautiously and opened the envelope first. Inside lay another handwritten message. "Every generation believes history belongs behind them. Only a true archivist understands that history is always waiting ahead." She unfolded the second sheet tucked beneath it. This page contained detailed instructions unlike anything she had encountered so far. The first archive preserved memory, not ownership. Those who arrive here must decide whether knowledge will remain hidden or return to every generation that follows. Savannah quietly lowered the page. Margaret looked toward the empty journal. "Perhaps you are supposed to write something." Savannah considered the possibility before opening the blank book. To her surprise, only the first page was empty. Every page afterward already contained names, hundreds of them: librarians, historians, teachers, translators, astronomers, archivists. None carried royal titles, none claimed fame or wealth. They were ordinary people from different centuries whose only common purpose had been preserving truth. Beside each name appeared one short sentence describing the knowledge they had protected for future generations. Savannah slowly turned the final page. Unlike the others, this one remained blank except for a single line waiting beneath it. She immediately understood. The journal had never been recording important people. It recorded important choices. Before she could speak, footsteps echoed faintly somewhere far above in the library. Not Margaret. Someone else had entered the building. Margaret checked her watch with sudden concern. The library closed nearly an hour ago. Both women instinctively listened. Another set of footsteps joined the first. Calm, deliberate, unfamiliar. Savannah quietly closed the journal. Someone else is here. High above them, 3 elegantly dressed visitors walked through the silent reading room with measured confidence. They appeared perfectly ordinary to anyone passing outside. Well-tailored coats, polished shoes, calm expressions, yet none carried library cards or spoke above a whisper. One silver-haired gentleman paused beside the historical mural where Savannah had discovered the hidden markings. His sharp eyes lingered upon the exposed section of wall before he quietly smiled. She found the passage. A younger woman standing beside him folded her hands faster than anyone predicted. The third visitor adjusted his glasses while surveying the quiet library. The council underestimated her. None of them noticed a fourth figure standing silently across the street beyond the front windows. Dressed in a dark charcoal coat, Captain Matteo watched the building from a respectful distance. He made no attempt to enter. His orders were clear: observe, protect. Never interfere unless absolutely necessary. He quietly touched the communication device concealed inside his coat. "Your Majesty," he said softly, "others have arrived before us." Hundreds of miles away, King Enzo Vitali stood alone inside the Royal Observatory, studying the same constellations Savannah had followed. Without looking away from the stars, he answered calmly, "I expected they would." Matteo hesitated before asking, "Should I reveal myself?" Enzo's response came without the slightest pause. No, she must believe every choice remains her own. Truth loses its meaning the moment it is guided by fear or power. Back inside the hidden chamber, Savannah carefully placed the silver key beside the empty journal. Her eyes returned to the final blank page awaiting its next guardian. She understood now that the greatest mystery had never been about discovering a secret room or solving an impossible code. It was about deciding what should happen once the truth was finally found. At that exact moment, the brass compass resting inside the first chamber began spinning once more. Instead of pointing toward another hidden doorway, it slowly settled in an entirely new direction. This time it pointed beyond the walls of Ashcroft Historical Library, beyond Boston itself, toward the distant mountains where the final archive and its waiting guardian still remained. The realization settled quietly over Savannah as she looked at the brass compass pointing beyond everything familiar. The hidden chambers beneath Ashcroft Historical Library had never been the destination. They were simply preparing someone worthy to continue a journey that had been waiting across centuries. She carefully closed the empty Guardian journal without writing her name. It felt premature. She had uncovered remarkable truths, but instinct told her the story was far from complete. Margaret noticed the thoughtful expression on Savannah's face and smiled gently. "You are not ready to write your page yet." Savannah nodded. "Not until I understand why all of this exists." Together they returned through the stone corridor, locking the hidden chamber exactly as they had found it. The ancient bookshelf quietly slid back into place, concealing every trace of the passage behind thousands of ordinary library books. Anyone walking through the archive the next morning would never suspect an entire forgotten sanctuary rested only a few feet away. Savannah carefully wrapped the silver key, the mysterious journal, and the brass compass in archival cloth before placing them inside the climate-controlled preservation vault. She paused for a long moment before locking the heavy steel door. Whatever happened next, these artifacts deserved protection. Upstairs, the library remained strangely silent. The 3 elegant visitors who had entered earlier were nowhere to be seen. Only a faint scent of cedar lingered near the reading room, as though someone had quietly inspected every shelf before leaving without disturbing a single book. Margaret walked toward the front entrance and checked the security monitor. "That is odd," she whispered. Savannah joined her. The recording showed empty hallways throughout the evening. No visitors had entered after closing, no doors had opened, no alarms had sounded. Yet both of them had clearly heard footsteps echoing above while they explored the hidden chambers. Savannah quietly remembered the message inside the journal. History was never lost, it was only hidden. Perhaps not everyone who walked through history left footprints that cameras could record. The following morning, word of Savannah's discovery began spreading through academic circles much faster than either she or Margaret expected. Historians from prestigious universities called requesting access to the unidentified manuscript. Museums offered generous funding for restoration rights. International research foundations sent formal letters asking to examine the mysterious celestial symbols. By noon, Television reporters had begun gathering outside Ashcroft Historical Library after rumors spread that an undocumented historical archive had been discovered beneath the building. Savannah felt increasingly uncomfortable with the sudden attention. She had never wanted recognition, she simply wanted answers. During the afternoon, another visitor quietly arrived without cameras or publicity. He introduced himself only as Professor Adrian Whitmore, a respected historian specializing in forgotten civilizations. His silver hair, calm voice, and perfectly tailored grey suit gave him the appearance of an ordinary academic, yet Savannah immediately noticed something unusual. His eyes never settled upon the priceless manuscript resting inside the display case. Instead, they studied her with thoughtful curiosity. "Miss Reed," he said politely, "may I ask what convinced you the symbols were maps rather than language?" Savannah smiled modestly. "Because languages describe ideas. These symbols describe movement." The professor remained silent for several seconds before giving a small nod of genuine admiration. Most scholars spent centuries asking what the manuscript wanted to say. He smiled warmly. "You asked where it wanted to go?" Savannah looked surprised. "How did you know others studied it?" The professor's expression remained gentle. "Because some mysteries leave records even when the objects themselves disappear." Before Savannah could ask another question, he reached into his coat and placed a small folded card upon the table. "When the time comes to travel, you will need this." He quietly walked away before she could stop him. The card contained only a train schedule leading toward a remote mountain region hundreds of miles north, along with one handwritten sentence. "Some destinations cannot be found on ordinary maps." Watching discreetly from across the street, Captain Matteo observed the entire exchange without interfering. He immediately contacted King Enzo Vitale. "Your Majesty, members of the council have begun making contact." Enzo stood inside the royal library surrounded by shelves older than most civilizations. He slowly closed an ancient volume before answering. "Did they threaten?" "No," Matteo replied. "They are trying to guide her." Enzo remained thoughtful. "That is more dangerous." Matteo understood immediately. Guidance carried hidden influence. If Savannah accepted someone else's interpretation before discovering the complete truth herself, every answer afterward would forever be shaped by another person's intentions. "Should I intervene now?" Matteo asked. Enzo walked toward the enormous stained glass window overlooking the mountain valley. Evening sunlight illuminated his pale features while distant bells echoed softly through the ancient kingdom. "No," he answered quietly. "The archive chose her because she follows evidence instead of voices. Trust that choice." Back in Boston, Savannah unfolded the mysterious train schedule once more after the library closed for the evening. The route ended near a mountain range she had never visited. As she compared it with her grandfather's celestial map, her heart skipped a beat. The final point marked by the spiral of stars rested directly beyond those same mountains. Every clue she had uncovered over the past several days now pointed toward one inevitable destination. She slowly looked through the library window at the evening sky where the first stars had begun appearing above the city. Somewhere beyond those distant mountains waited the final archive, the last guardian, and the truth that even centuries of history had carefully protected until the day a quiet librarian was finally ready to find it. Savannah spent the next 2 days preparing for a journey she had never expected to take. She requested a week of unpaid leave from Ashcroft Historical Library, carefully documented every artifact she had uncovered, and entrusted Margaret with the preservation vault should anything unexpected happen during her absence. Margaret listened quietly as Savannah explained the chain of discoveries that had led from the anonymous manuscript to the forgotten underground archive, and finally toward the distant mountains marked on both the celestial map and the mysterious train schedule. When Savannah finished, Margaret smiled with the calm certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime surrounded by stories. "Every great library exists because someone was willing to leave home in search of knowledge," she said. "Perhaps this is simply your turn." Early the following morning, Savannah boarded a northbound train carrying only a small suitcase, her grandfather's celestial map, carefully reproduced copies of her research notes, and the brass compass, which she kept wrapped inside a padded leather case. She deliberately left the original manuscript, journal, and silver key secured inside the library vault. Somehow she felt the journey required understanding rather than possession. As the train rolled away from Boston, the familiar skyline slowly disappeared behind rolling hills painted with the warm colors of early autumn. Hours passed peacefully while cities gave way to forests, and forests slowly yielded to rugged mountains stretching across the northern horizon. Savannah spent most of the trip comparing her notes with the old celestial map, searching for connections she might have overlooked. Every pattern still pointed toward the same isolated region where ordinary maps offered almost no information. Late that afternoon, the conductor stopped beside her seat holding an envelope. This was left with station security before departure, he explained. They asked that I give it to the passenger in seat 12 once we reached the mountain line. Savannah looked surprised. Did they say who left it? The conductor politely shook his head. Only that you would know when to open it. Once he walked away, Savannah carefully unfolded the cream-colored envelope. Inside rested a beautifully illustrated map showing narrow mountain roads, rivers, and old stone bridges absent from every modern atlas she had consulted. Written across the bottom appeared another familiar sentence in elegant handwriting. The shortest road rarely reaches the oldest truth. There was still no signature, no explanation. Yet, unlike earlier messages, this map contained practical directions leading toward a secluded valley beyond the train's final destination. Savannah quietly smiled. Whoever had been guiding her understood both history and patience. Far beyond the mountains, King Enzo Vitale stood inside the Hall of Records where every royal decree issued during the past 6 centuries had been preserved. Long rays of afternoon sunlight filtered through towering stained glass windows, illuminating shelves that seemed endless. Captain Matteo approached carrying another sealed report. Your Majesty, he said respectfully, Savannah Reed has begun traveling north. Enzo accepted the report without opening it. Then history continues exactly as it should. Matteo hesitated before speaking again. The council remains divided. Several members believe the final archive should remain hidden forever. Enzo slowly walked toward a glass case displaying a weathered parchment older than his own reign. Fear always speaks first when truth approaches, he replied quietly. Matteo lowered his voice. Some are asking whether you intend to reveal the complete record if she succeeds. Enzo rested one pale hand against the glass. Beneath it lay the original charter of the First Guardians, written centuries before he became king. I made that promise long before I accepted the crown, he answered. A ruler may protect a kingdom, an archivist must protect the truth, even when it humbles the throne itself. Matteo looked thoughtfully at his king. After 600 years, he finally understood why Enzo had never allowed the ancient charter to be rewritten. Meanwhile, Savannah stepped off the train at a quiet mountain station, surrounded by towering evergreens and crisp autumn air. The platform held only a handful of travelers, yet one elderly station attendant greeted her with an unusually warm smile. You must be Miss Reed, he said kindly. Savannah blinked in surprise. Have we met? The man chuckled softly while handing her a small paper bag containing fresh bread and a bottle of water. No, but someone asked that every traveler carrying a star map be welcomed with kindness. Before Savannah could ask another question, he tipped his cap and returned inside the station office. She looked around, but there was no sign of whoever had arranged such thoughtful preparations. As evening approached, Savannah followed the handwritten map along a narrow mountain road bordered by tall pines whose branches swayed gently in the cool breeze. The brass compass rested in her jacket pocket, and for the first time since leaving Boston, its needle pointed steadily ahead without changing direction. After nearly 2 miles of walking, the forest suddenly opened into a breathtaking valley unlike anything she had imagined. At its center stood an elegant stone monastery surrounded by ancient gardens, crystal-clear streams, and towering oak trees older than the United States itself. There were no security gates, no warning signs. Only a simple wooden archway bearing one familiar emblem carved into the weathered timber, a crescent moon embracing a single star. As Savannah stepped beneath the arch, a distant bell rang once across the peaceful valley. High above, inside the monastery library, a tall figure quietly closed the book he had been reading and turned toward the window overlooking the entrance. For the first time in 600 years, King Enzo Vitale watched the one person who had followed the entire path without being commanded, persuaded, or frightened into doing so, and in that silent moment he realized history had chosen more wisely than even he had dared to hope. The monastery welcomed Savannah with an almost impossible sense of peace. Stone pathways wound through quiet gardens where autumn leaves drifted gently across crystal-clear streams, and every building seemed designed to exist in harmony with the mountains surrounding it. There were no guards standing at the entrance, no signs restricting visitors, and no questions about why she had come. Instead, an elderly woman wearing a simple grey robe greeted her with a warm smile. "Welcome, Miss Reed," she said softly, as though she had been expecting her for years. You must be tired after your journey. Savannah blinked in surprise. How do you know my name? The woman simply gestured toward the monastery doors. The library has been waiting for you far longer than I have. She led Savannah through wide stone corridors lined with paintings unlike any she had ever seen. They did not depict battles, rulers, or monuments. Instead, each canvas honored ordinary people reading, writing, preserving manuscripts, teaching children, or quietly repairing damaged books. Beneath every portrait appeared only a name and a date, never a title. Savannah noticed something remarkable. Several of the names matched those recorded inside the Guardian journal hidden beneath Ashcroft Historical Library. These were not legends. They had been real people whose greatest achievement had been protecting knowledge for strangers they would never meet. The elderly guide eventually stopped before two towering wooden doors carved with the familiar crescent moon embracing a solitary star. She looked kindly at Savannah before saying, "Beyond this room, no one will tell you what to believe. You will only be shown what has always been true." With that, she quietly stepped aside. The heavy doors opened without a sound. Savannah entered slowly, and her breath caught almost immediately. The library stretched farther than her eyes could follow. Endless shelves of ancient books rose beneath by warm natural light pouring through enormous skylights. Instead of feeling grand or intimidating, the space felt welcoming, almost alive, as though every carefully preserved volume carried the quiet gratitude of generations who had refused to let knowledge disappear. At the center of the library stood a single long table crafted from polished walnut. One man waited there alone. He appeared to be in his early 30s, dressed in an elegant black suit that seemed timeless rather than fashionable. His dark hair contrasted with remarkably pale skin, and his calm, silver-grey eyes reflected quiet wisdom instead of authority. He closed the leather-bound book before him and rose as Savannah approached. Neither spoke immediately. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, like two readers meeting in the quietest corner of a familiar library. Finally, the man smiled with genuine warmth. His voice was calm, steady, and carried the quiet confidence of someone who had no need to impress anyone. Savannah returned the smile politely. "I have a feeling you already know why I came." He nodded once. "You followed the questions instead of the answers." She studied him carefully. "Who are you?" He considered the question before replying. "My name is Enzo Vitale." The name meant nothing to Savannah, yet something about him felt strangely familiar. Perhaps it was the same quiet patience she had sensed throughout every clue that had guided her here. Enzo gestured toward the chair across from him. "Please sit." As she took her seat, he placed an old parchment map upon the table between them. It displayed the same 7 archives she had already discovered, but one important difference immediately caught her attention. The final archive had never been marked as a destination. It was labeled simply, "The Beginning." Savannah looked up in confusion. "I thought I had reached the end of the journey." Enzo smiled gently. "That is what every guardian believes until they arrive." He slowly unfolded another document. Unlike the maps and coded manuscripts she had studied before, this page contained a straightforward historical record. It described how centuries earlier, leaders from many different civilizations secretly agreed that no single kingdom, government, or ruler should ever control all human knowledge. Instead, they entrusted independent archivists with preserving original records exactly as they were written, untouched by politics, ambition, or personal pride. Savannah read every line in thoughtful silence. "So the first archive was never created to hide history," she whispered. "It was created to protect it from being rewritten." Enzo's eyes reflected quiet admiration. "Exactly," he watched as the realization settled across her face. "For hundreds of years," he continued, "people assumed the greatest power belonged to those who ruled nations. They were mistaken. The greatest responsibility has always belonged to those who preserve the truth." Savannah slowly looked around the magnificent library once again. Every shelf suddenly carried deeper meaning. This was not a vault of secrets. It was a promise kept across generations by ordinary people who believed that future readers deserved honest history. She turned back toward Enzo. "You have protected this place for a very long time, have not you?" For the first time, a faint trace of melancholy crossed his otherwise peaceful expression, long enough to watch centuries become chapters. Savannah sensed there was far more to his story, yet she did not interrupt. Instead, she quietly asked the question that mattered most. "If all of this has survived for so long, why reveal it to me now?" Enzo looked toward the towering shelves before answering. "Because history reaches moments when it must stop hiding and begin teaching again. At that exact moment, sunlight passed through the great skylights above, illuminating a magnificent mural across the far wall that Savannah had not noticed before. It portrayed every guardian recorded in the journal, each passing a single book to the next generation. The final figure remained unfinished, its face left completely blank, waiting for the one person whose chapter had only just begun. Savannah stood silently before the unfinished figure on the mural, unable to look away from the blank face waiting to be completed. She had spent her entire life believing history belonged to the past, carefully organized onto shelves where curious readers could borrow it for a few weeks before returning it. Now she understood something far greater. History was alive because ordinary people continued choosing honesty over convenience, generation after generation. Enzo Vitale watched her study the mural without interrupting. After 6 centuries, he had learned that the most important truths could never be taught through speeches. They had to be discovered quietly, one realization at a time. Savannah finally turned toward him. "You knew I would come here long before I did not you?" Enzo answered with complete honesty. "I hoped someone would, I never knew who." He walked toward one of the towering shelves and carefully removed an old leather volume bound in dark blue cloth. Unlike the priceless manuscripts surrounding them, this book appeared surprisingly ordinary. He placed it gently upon the walnut table and opened it to the first page. Hundreds of signatures filled the parchment. Some were elegant, others were hurried. A few belonged to people who had clearly learned to write only late in life. Every guardian who completed the journey was invited to leave one sentence, Enzo explained, not about themselves, about what they learned. Savannah slowly turned the pages. One entry read, "Knowledge grows when it is shared, not when it is guarded." Another simply said, "The truth never fears another question." A third, written nearly 200 years earlier, declared, "Libraries are the quiet heartbeat of every civilization." Each sentence was different, yet together they formed a conversation stretching across centuries. Savannah looked up thoughtfully. None of them claimed to save the world. Enzo smiled softly. Because none of them tried. He paused before continuing. They simply refused to let it forget itself. A comfortable silence settled between them while warm afternoon light drifted across the endless shelves. Finally, Savannah asked the question that had quietly remained in her thoughts ever since they first met. "Who are you really?" Enzo did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked toward a nearby window overlooking the peaceful valley below. The mountains stretched endlessly beneath a sky slowly changing toward evening. "I am the current keeper of this library," he said calmly. Savannah gently shook her head. "That is what you do. It is not who you are." For the first time since they had met, Enzo looked directly into her eyes with complete openness. "I have also been called the Vampire King." Savannah remained perfectly still. The words should have sounded impossible. Instead, every unexplained clue from the past several days quietly settled into place. His remarkable composure, his knowledge of centuries, the extraordinary patience with which everyone inside the monastery treated him. Most surprising of all, she felt no fear, only understanding. "You never hid it," she said quietly. Enzo gave a faint smile. "You never asked." Savannah laughed softly despite herself. "Fair enough." She studied him for another long moment before speaking again. "Then everything people believe about your kingdom," Enzo slowly nodded, "contains truth, legend, misunderstanding, and imagination mixed together, like most history." Savannah considered that answer carefully before smiling. "That sounds exactly like every archive I have ever organized." For the first time in many years, genuine laughter echoed through the great library. It was quiet, warm, and unexpectedly ordinary. When the laughter faded, Enzo became thoughtful once more. "Many members of my council believe these records should remain hidden forever," he admitted. "They fear honesty will weaken the stability built over generations." Savannah gently rested one hand upon the old Guardian book. "Truth does not destroy trust." She looked around the magnificent library. "Discovering that someone corrected history because they cared enough to preserve it makes me trust them more, not less." Enzo lowered his eyes briefly. During 6 centuries of ruling, countless advisors had argued through politics, strategy, and fear. Yet no one had ever expressed the purpose of the first archive with such simple clarity. He quietly walked toward another display case standing beneath the unfinished mural. Inside rested a beautifully crafted silver seal engraved with the familiar crescent moon embracing a solitary star. Without ceremony, he lifted it from its resting place and placed it upon the table before Savannah. "For 600 years, he said softly, I believed I was protecting this archive." He looked toward the mural where the final guardian still had no face. "Today you reminded me that the archive has always been protecting us." Savannah looked from the silver seal to the unfinished Guardian mural before gently sliding the seal back toward Enzo. Then it should stay exactly where it belongs. She smiled warmly. I did not come here looking for titles. Enzo studied her quietly before inclining his head with profound respect. It was not the formal acknowledgement of a king greeting a guest. It was the sincere gratitude of one guardian recognizing another. Beyond the towering windows, the evening bell rang gently across the valley. One by one, scholars, librarians, historians, and caretakers throughout the monastery paused their work and smiled without knowing why. Deep within the ancient library, the unfinished figure upon the mural slowly changed. Soft colors spread across the blank face until, for the first time in centuries, the final guardian was no longer an empty outline. It now carried the calm features of a quiet librarian from Boston, whose greatest strength had never been solving an impossible mystery, but approaching every mystery with humility, patience, and the unwavering belief that truth deserved to be understood by everyone. The following morning, the monastery awakened beneath a sky so clear that every mountain peak seemed carved from light itself. Savannah stood on the stone terrace outside the great library, breathing in the crisp air while watching the first rays of sunlight spill across the valley. For the first time in days, there were no riddles waiting to be solved, no hidden doors to discover, and no mysterious symbols demanding interpretation. Instead, there was clarity. The journey had never been about reaching a secret place. It had been about becoming the kind of person worthy of protecting the truth once it was found. Behind her, the great library doors opened quietly. Enzo Vitali stepped outside, carrying a single leather portfolio. He walked beside Savannah without speaking for several moments, allowing the peaceful silence to say everything words did not need to express. Finally, he handed her the portfolio. Inside rested beautifully prepared copies of the most important historical records preserved within the first archive. Carefully translated into modern English and accompanied by scholarly notes explaining their origins without revealing the location of the monastery or the identities of those who had protected it for centuries. Savannah looked up in surprise. "You are trusting me with these?" Enzo nodded. "The knowledge belongs to the world, the sanctuary does not." Savannah smiled, understanding immediately. The purpose had never been to expose hidden people. It had always been to restore forgotten truth. "I will protect both," she promised. Enzo looked toward the endless shelves visible through the library windows. That is why the archive chose well. Later that morning, the scholars and caretakers of the monastery gathered in the central courtyard. There were no elaborate ceremonies, no speeches celebrating Savannah's accomplishments, and no grand declarations. Instead, each person simply offered a warm handshake, a quiet smile, or a thoughtful conversation about books, history, and the generations yet to come. It felt less like saying goodbye to strangers and more like leaving lifelong friends whose names she had only just learned. Before Savannah departed, the elderly woman who had welcomed her on the first day approached carrying a small wooden box. "A gift," she said kindly. Inside rested a handcrafted bookmark carved from pale maple wood. Upon it was engraved the familiar crescent moon embracing a solitary star, followed by one simple sentence: "Leave every reader wiser than you found them." Savannah carefully slipped the bookmark inside her grandfather's celestial map before thanking the woman with genuine gratitude. As the afternoon train carried her back toward Boston, she watched the mountains gradually disappear beyond the horizon. She no longer felt as though she was leaving something behind. Instead, she carried its purpose with her. Several days later, Ashcroft Historical Library reopened its underground sanctuary, not as a hidden chamber, but as a carefully restored historical exhibit dedicated to the anonymous guardians who had preserved knowledge across generations. The artifacts remained protected, but their story was finally told with honesty. Scholars from around the world visited not to claim forgotten treasures, but to learn how ordinary people had quietly defended truth through patience, humility, and courage. Savannah returned to her familiar desk beneath the warm brass reading lamp. Where children once again wandered through the aisles searching for adventure, students hurried between research tables and elderly visitors smiled while borrowing books they had loved for decades. To everyone else, she appeared exactly as she always had, a kind librarian who remembered every reader's favorite author and never hesitated to help someone find the right book. Only Margaret noticed the quiet difference. One evening, as they finished shelving returned books together, Margaret asked softly, "Did you find what you were looking for?" Savannah paused before placing the final volume onto its shelf. She smiled gently. "No." Margaret looked curious. Savannah continued, "I found something much better. I learned that history is not a collection of old stories. It is a promise we make to the future. Margaret nodded thoughtfully, as though she had known that answer all along. Months passed. New research inspired by the restored records corrected long misunderstood historical events, connected forgotten civilizations, and encouraged libraries across the country to preserve original archives with renewed care. Quietly, without seeking recognition, Savannah helped countless researchers uncover forgotten truths simply by asking better questions. Far away in the mountain monastery, King Enzo Vitale stood once more before the great mural inside the first archive. Every guardian across centuries now looked complete. At the very end of the procession, Savannah's painted figure stood holding not a crown, nor a key, nor an ancient manuscript, but an ordinary library book toward the next unseen reader. Enzo smiled with quiet satisfaction before closing the Guardian journal one final time. After 600 years, its final page no longer waited in silence. Savannah Reed had written only one sentence beneath her name: "The greatest mysteries are never solved by the most powerful people. They are solved by those who care enough to keep asking honest questions." Enzo gently returned the journal to its place among the shelves before extinguishing the final reading lamp. Outside, evening settled peacefully across the valley while countless stars appeared one by one above the mountains. Somewhere hundreds of miles away, inside a small public library in Boston, a young girl approached the front desk holding an old astronomy book and asked the librarian with a hopeful smile, "Can you help me find where this story begins?" Savannah smiled exactly as someone once had for her. "Of course," she said warmly as she opened the book. "The best stories always begin with a question."